in my book, I write a lot about how young blacks often end up self-segregating or cordoning themselves off from the wider mainstream culture. And it is something that's very controversial to say today. There's there's a tendency not to want to make cultural arguments. There's an idea that when you criticize non-systemic factors, non-institutional structural factors, you're blaming the victim, which is not at all what I intended to do, but there is a real phenomenon in Black life where a kind of oppositional culture can develop where you take yourself outside of the mainstream white culture, or you do things like you define yourself as opposed to white values. So I read a lot about how book learning or scholarship or kind of developing your intellectual interests is seen as something that's white. And so there's a kind of idea that school life is not really authentically Black. And this is certainly not a universal aspect of Black life, but it's kind of a pernicious undercurrent that can happen and that can be glorified and glamorized in the hip-hop culture that celebrates the inner city or the ghetto as the mecca of Black life. So yeah, I think that there is an element of self-segregation that exists, but it's tricky to say these things today. We always fear that we're kicking down or blaming victims, but I think that if you're serious about equality, then to deny that cultural factors, that different cultures celebrate different values the way different families can, you're not going to actually solve the problem if you take an enormous aspect of the way life is lived off the table. I don't think that racial pride is gone. I think that actually we live in a moment where there's quite a bit of racial pride, and that's a good thing. I think that the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and his re-election in 2012 somehow permanently changed the image of Blackness in America. I know that there's been an enormous amount of disappointment since we seem to have slid back into a populist era with Donald Trump. But I think that actually we're going to come back and look at this moment as a minor setback, and that the country is really trending towards something much better that was captured in the movement towards what Obama exemplified. I think there's a lot of pride. I think that there's a social justice movement that has happened around Black Lives Matter that has spilled into Me Too. I mean, Me Too was started by a Black woman. That's an enormous social justice movement that has profoundly affected contemporary American life. I think that there's quite a lot to celebrate and be proud of. And I think that there's a lot of good that's come out of hip-hop. I mean, it's certainly done quite a lot to make Black culture, life, aesthetics visible to the world. France is the second largest market for hip-hop in the world. I mean, hip-hop has done something that seduced and captivated the world. And I think I never critique it on a musical level. I never come at it from the point of view of a jazz snob or something like that. I think there's an enormous amount of creativity. I just think that hip-hop exists as a kind of, it transmits values, it transmits content. It's not the form that we critique. We have to take a serious look at what type of values are celebrated and what are glorified and commercialized. And so in that sense, I think that it's done some social harm. It's kind of conflated an idea of authentic Blackness with street credibility. But there's plenty to be celebrated and to be preserved. I still think that being cool in a lot of portions of America, not just Black America, but certainly in Latino America and increasingly in lots of parts of white America, means, well, I wouldn't even say increasingly. There's always been a strong anti-intellectual current in American life. And I think that being cool has always been largely tied to a kind of rejection of the intellect. And this pervades American life across ethnic categories, but I think it's particularly dangerous to minorities and to people without a lot of social and network capital to kind of protect them. So I think that like Blacks and Latinos can get caught up in a downward cycle of emphasizing adolescent values, athleticism, promiscuity, kind of being a player with the opposite sex. Things that kind of really work well when you're a teenager, but that rapidly decline in value once you reach your adult years. And if you don't have a kind of social safety net to break your fall, I think that's a very dangerous kind of charade to get caught up in. So it's not nothing. I think that actually nothing in the book is inherently black, but I think it can some of these traps can particularly hurt vulnerable populations, which happen overwhelmingly to be black. I do think my father saved me from a dangerous masculinity, what we would call in today's parlance toxic masculinity. I don't think that the kind of masculine identity that he personified was a feminized masculinity. I mean, he was a very masculine man, but I think there's a very good masculinity that can be preserved, as opposed to the kind of toxic variety that gets celebrated in hip-hop culture, in a lot of sports culture, and a lot of Hollywood culture. I think that the values that he modeled for me, integrity, honesty, loyalty, generosity, he's the most generous, probably the most generous human being I've ever been around. He takes care of his family, you know, strength, a kind of stoicism. Not to say that, you know, these are not feminine values, but he embodied a kind of stoicism that we classically think of as being masculine, you know, a kind of suffering and a kind of sacrifice for the next generation. My mother did too. She did it from what we kind of think of as maternal values. You know, she took care of the home. But my father modeled a masculinity that I tend to think of a lot now that I'm a parent. I have a 5-year-old daughter and an 11-month-old son, and I don't think you have to sacrifice the kind of masculine ideal to be able to embody it with integrity. I think that there are a lot of stereotypes, received stereotypes for hundreds of years now in the United States about black fatherhood, and some of them come from the very real fact that under slavery and after, I mean, black families were forcibly separated. Marriage was something that was denied to black families, and so again, it comes back to what I was saying about culture. It's very difficult to believe that for generations and centuries you could forcibly break up families, sell mothers and children away from fathers, force men to couple with women that were not their wives if you were breeding slaves. It's strange to think that you could do that for generations and there wouldn't be social residues from that there wouldn't be cultural practices that were harmful, that were inherited, ways of life that have to be overcome. So while it's true that statistically there's lots of problems that you can kind of break down into the black community with absent fathers, a lot of that is also exacerbated by the fact that many fathers are removed from the neighborhood within an extraordinarily punitive criminal justice system. So black fatherhood there's nothing inherently wrong or troubled with black fatherhood, but it is true that this demographic faces quite a lot of challenges and has quite a lot of adversity to overcome. So I think that, you know, my father, or the type of father that I've become, I think that that's an authentically black way of being a father. But I do think that there's a lot of progress to be made still. Yeah, you only realize in retrospect that you become a cliche. But I was always struck by a quote that Richard Wright said. He said that there was more freedom in a square block in Paris than there was in the entire United States of America for him. James Baldwin said that he would have been destroyed if he hadn't found a way to leave New York with $40 in his pocket and come to Paris. I ended up in Paris first as a 20-year-old student at Georgetown who desperately had to finish my French requirement. I came to Tours and then to Paris to try to get some credit in my language class. Fell in love with my French TA, and like many people, came to Paris initially because I loved a girl. Made friends, felt very much at home here, and part of feeling at home in Paris was a result of the fact that I think it was the first time in my life I felt that I existed outside of the white-black binary that does define so much American life. I felt myself to be an American here, which was really a liberating kind of sensation. Then, with friends in France, I came back to write I wrote In Soudan Liberté, Losing My Cool, at a friend's studio in Montmartre. And eventually, through that group of friends, met my wife and ended up in Paris again because of my wife, but probably have stayed in Paris because there is a kind of liberation. I can go weeks without being conscious of my own racial identity in my day-to-day life. I'm always conscious of my racial identity in my work, but it becomes a kind of abstraction that I'm free to turn off when I go outside in the street. I'm not always watching for where a police officer is standing. And I found that that's a type of freedom of movement, freedom in my life that I wouldn't lightly trade back now.